Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Nice, nice. So I was so happy to be invited to talk about my research. But I wanted to start off with this little story. So a little few months ago, I was kind of like scrolling through the like chem ed literature, and inside of like 1990 or some like odd year like that, I saw that Marcy had published with Teresa. Teresa Zelinsky, who was a Monmouth University professor. So there's my degrees of separation, which I didn't even know about. Um, but at Monmouth, we do a lot of research here with undergraduate students. You see my two undergraduate students on screen who are responsible for a good chunk of this work. So I'm really proud of them. Right now, Jillian is a research scientist and publishes inside of medical laboratory education journals. Jamie is inside of med school and is currently doing like a educational capstone. So happy that the research has touched them. But yeah, let's take you on this journey. So the research that I tend to look at focuses around the teaching lab. We see that the research inside of the labs take a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of chemicals are used. This very old historical quote right here that says like there is insufficient data to confirm or reject convincingly statements made about the laboratory, the teaching laboratory. So basically, a lot of the research that I do centers around trying to address this. But of course, it is built off of the greats. So here actually is one of the first papers that I've read regarding the research done inside like the chemistry laboratory. It was a little publication that was done by Towns, Brett and Bruck, that tried to sort of kind of categorize the different inquiry levels of the lab. So here you can see we have all the way from level 0 confirmatory or cookbook labs all the way up to authentic or level 3 inquiry labs. So let's pare that back a little bit. And I want to take you here. So some of the research that has been done on these confirmatory or cookbook labs, again, coming out of the Towns group, we saw that they looked at students and they found that students' goals inside of the lab centered around completing, earning that grade, and feeling good. We saw that students also wanted to finish those labs really quickly. And students also had this like disconnect between lab task and concepts. This is very much disconnect. So these were the types of goals that we saw coming out of students inside of confirmatory labs. So I did a study looking more so at these guided inquiry labs, so different inquiry level. And some of the things that we saw centered around students looking at group versus individual task. So their perceptions about this inquiry lab focused more so on, group versus individual task. They also tended to focus on the autonomy that they had inside of the lab, because they were allowed to select different projects inside of the lab. We also saw them focusing on the ambiguity. So the fact that it wasn't a clean cookbook or confirmatory type lab. And we also saw that the students were focusing on the logistics of the lab. Again, how long is the lab? Can I finish the lab as quickly as possible? So all of these things were happening inside of, or all of these goals were centered inside of confirmatory labs, guided inquiry labs. But one of the thoughts that I had is, okay, so what about the types of assessment going across these labs? And typically inside of labs in general, the common assessment that is used is laboratory reports. There have been other studies that looked at different types of assessments in the lab, but most commonly laboratory reports are what is done. So this made me think, so do different types of assessment like affect the outcomes inside of lab? And this was kind of like my driving thought process moving forward. So let's talk a little bit about looking at assessments inside of the lab. Specifically at our university, we wanted to look at this biochemistry lab. So here's a little picture of how the biochemistry lab looks setup wise, just as an overview. So in terms of how this lab is set up, so there are generally 2 sections per each semester. Each of the sections has about 8 to maybe 12 students that are juniors or seniors inside of the class. These labs typically run 3 hours per week, and it's normally done on a 13-week semester. So this is the context of the lab that we're looking at to then think about assessment inside of the lab. A little bit more background about this lab. So the lab format is inside of a flipped format where students have assigned readings and videos inside of this lab that they complete before they come into the lab, and they do a pre-lab quiz. They're pretty short, like about 5 to 10 minutes. And then they actually perform the experiment. Then after all of this is done, students participate in a 30-minute lab interview, so some oral summative assessment with their laboratory instructor. And then at the end of the semester, they have a lab practical. It's normally based off of some type of technique that they learn throughout the semester. So again, a little bit more about the background of the setup of the experiments inside of this lab. So it's broken up into 2 parts. You have 4 weeks where they learn basic biochemistry techniques, such as, micropipetting, those types of things. And then inside of the next 9 weeks, they do a project. And this project deals with either the isolation and identification of enzymes in chicken or beef tissue samples. So that's what their project centers around, and they're allowed to choose which tissue sample. Most students choose the chicken because I think the beef, they say, smells really bad. So a little bit of background on the institution, and a little bit of background about what type of research has been done in the biochemistry realm. So when we look at the research inside of biochemistry, it tends to focus on single topics, and it also tends to focus primarily on structure and function, with particular emphasis on proteins, to a lesser extent DNA. We also see, when we look at the assessments that are done inside of biochemistry, you see they focus on problem-based learning, case discussions. There's a lot of multiple choice questions in formative assessments. And then there's also some concept inventories on enzyme substrates, those types of things. When we look at what research is done on the lab in biochemistry, a lot of it is CUR labs, so course-based undergraduate research experiences. And then a lot of the labs focus on 3D physical molecules, models of structures, and those types of things. But where the gap exists is that there's not really a lot of research on these less traditional assessments. So that's kind of where we're orienting this, where we're looking at how assessments affect labs, and we're looking at this specifically in biochemistry because it hasn't been done before. So in terms of the oral assessment, students are given similar questions, and here you can see an analytical rubric that the professor uses. Inside of this analytical rubric, there are higher order and lower order cognitive skills that are tested. So for example, one question asks, what's the max absorbance that is acceptable in the experiment? Whereas they also have questions that ask them to design an experiment similarly to what they have done and what changes they would make. So the questions range from that. So in order to look at this assessment, we wanted to think about what theoretical framework can help us frame and analyze and think about this. And we settled on the meaningful learning framework, which looks at the cognitive domain that involves the knowledge, the affective domain that involves motions, feelings, their attitudes, and then their psychomotor domain, which focuses on physical movements. And this is nicely summarized in this graphic from the Brett's group. So our guide and research study into this was, what is the common lived experiences of students participating in interview assessments for the biochemistry lab? So our methodological framework that allowed us to carry out this study and figure out like what is happening was phenomenology. So phenomenology, what it does is it tries to uncover the core structure of a phenomenon by examining the common shared experiences. So I always like to put a little graphic with this to explain. So let's say inside of the lab, the instructor is interviewing all of these different students, right? And they all have different thoughts and feelings and knowledge that they're sharing with the instructor. So phenomenology tries to find what is common inside of all of those experiences to essentially find the essence of the phenomenon. So a background about our institution, we have a medium-sized institution that's primarily undergraduate. We have 61% of our population being female, 25% being underrepresented minorities, and about 70% of our students are part-time. So in the study, we got IRB approval. It was conducted in fall 2018, 2019, and we used purposeful sample, which we wanted students who were 18 or older. They completed the lab for the first time, and then we recruited them at the end of the semester after they had the experience, because that's what we were interested in. So we had a good amount of participants, but after our 11th participant, actually, that's when we saw that we reached data saturation. We continued on with the interviews just to make sure like we had everything, and it was good. So for our study interviews, we used a semi-structured protocol. We piloted the interview with 2 students, and these students were interviewed by a CER interviewer. We got signed consent forms. We audio recorded it. The length was about 30 to 48 minutes, and they were compensated with a $10 gift card for this. So more importantly, some of the questions that we asked them about their oral assessment were, can you describe the experience inside of the biochemistry lab? Can you describe to me the interview process for your biochemistry lab? And things like, how did you prepare for your lab interviews? So those are some of the questions that helped us kind of tease at their experience inside of these oral assessments. So in terms of data analysis, so we had the audio recordings, we transcribed those, or my students transcribed those, because, you know, transcribing is a lot. And then we had those 2 students code. They used the open coding approach. And after they had their different set of codes, we did the constant comparison method. After that was completed, we distilled it down into emergent themes. And then these emergent themes were checked by members. We had the student participants, some of them checked. We also had the instructor check about these emergent themes, as well as an independent CER researcher. So here's the big data table. Of course, you're not supposed to read all of this, but let's go through and break it down to see what emerged. So the findings that emerged was this nice outcome space where we saw that students talked about this promotion of deeper understanding. They talked about the lab interviews actually affecting the actions they took inside of lab. And they also talked about the uneasy feelings that the lab interviews elicited from them. In essence, though, most students describe this revealing of knowledge and understanding that the lab interviews did that other assessments, such as lab reports, were not able to do, in their opinion. So let's take a look at the cognitive domain. So some of the things we saw popping out of this, where students talk about that promotion of deeper learning, were the types of questions that were asked. Here we have Gio says, I like a challenge. I like the harder questions. I wouldn't want him to just say, oh, what concentrations would you use? I'd want to understand why I use that concentration. So it was stuff like, it was those kinds of questions that I enjoyed, that I thought were good for everybody to know and understand why you did, why you used them, and I guess understand the lab. So here we see Gio talking about the types of questions that was inside, or that the instructor actually asked, provoking them to think more so about what they were doing and why things were happening in the lab. Another thing we saw students talk about was the informal format that helped promote this deeper learning. Here we have Riley, who actually English was Riley's second language. And we saw them talking about these lab interviews and how that helped. Here, Riley said, but lab reports, I hate writing lab reports. I hate writing essays. That's why I think interviews are better, because you just kind of have to know the material and like speak. You could tell him what you wanted to say. You could explain him better than just writing it on paper. So we saw that students talked about this informal format as promoting deeper learning, because they were able to convey information that necessarily wouldn't be as, easily talked about inside of a lab report. And another theme that I'll be skipping over is the instant feedback. Students also talked about that. In terms of the psychomotor domain, students talked about effective actions and how their actions were necessarily affected inside of the lab, because they knew they had to prepare for this interview. Here, Peyton says, in Gen Chem and Orgo, we have to do 5 post-lab questions. And I feel like that doesn't really help you, because you could just look them up online. But in an interview, it forces you to think on the spot and constantly be aware of what you're doing in the lab and pay attention during the lab. So here we see students talking about the fact that they know that they have these interviews propelling them to take action in how they prepared and what they were writing down inside of the lab. We also see Casey talking about how this encouraged active and not passive participation inside of the lab. Here, Casey says, during the lab, I would write notes on my lab paper about what we did or how much stuff we added. Just because for lab reports, people just Google them. And I don't really think conceptually what's going on. But with the interviews, you were face to face with him. You had to give the right answer, and you weren't allowed your textbook. So you could only use your notes. So you had to know what you were talking about. So we see that these lab interviews were propelling them to participate, to be prepared, to write down notes, to think about why they were adding something to a beaker. And lastly, we saw students talk about mostly their uneasy feelings they had with the lab interview. Here we see Peyton talking about stress. Peyton says, well, I felt stressed the first time because I didn't know what to expect. But after I did the first interview, I knew this is fine, because it's like a conversation rather than just me giving me questions. In Orgo Lab, I feel like there's no way of knowing if the kids actually understood the lab or if they just looked the answers up or got them from someone else. So we see this theme, popping up a lot inside, where students compare about just having to write these lab reports and go into the internet for the answers. Here we also see them talked about feelings, though, of intimidation. Marion says, interviews were intimidating. If your professor is asking you questions firsthand and you don't really know the answer straight off the bat, so you had to definitely come prepared to the interview, knowing the lab, knowing exactly what you did. So we see that these interviews, having to sit down with your professor, propel them and having these feelings of being stressed, feeling intimidated. Another theme that popped up was students talking about nervousness, but we won't go over that because we want to be on time. So in summary, what we saw was that students talked a lot about the uneasy feelings that they had inside of that affective domain. But these uneasy feelings, some of them said they propel them to improve their performance inside of the lab. It made them think about what they were doing, what they were writing, the things that they were doing in the lab. And then they talked about the deeper understanding that came about from these oral assessments, because they were being asked this directly and couldn't go to Google for answers. So some of the limitations that I want to talk about inside of phenomenology studies, they don't necessarily reveal the truth. They reveal the truth of the students. So these were students' perceptions. We present our best explanation of how these students experience the lab interviews as a form of assessment. And this was specifically for upper level undergraduate biochemistry class. We don't know if we will see similar things for, let's say, a general chemistry course. And one of the things I also want to say is we don't advocate that all lab assessments are oral assessments. Laboratory reports are important and they have their place. We're just suggesting that this is another alternative way that you can assess. Again, this laboratory assessment, it was not conducted in other populations. And finally, oral assessments, we do acknowledge that it can be challenging inside of large laboratories. One of the things we are thinking about inside of large laboratories is the use of group oral assessments. So that's one of the things we're looking at, actually. But yeah, so some of the conclusion is, I want us to start thinking, so this recent move that we had when we were in COVID, where we had online courses, it forced us to kind of think about more creative ways to assess. And what I really want this is to open up a conversation about alternative ways that we can assess students. For oral assessments, we saw that it revealed knowledge gaps. We saw that it motivated students to actively participate in their knowledge construction. And we saw that face-to-face element of lab interviews catalyzes students to understand the material rather than rely on outside Google sources. So yeah, with that, thank you so much. And again, thank you so much to my undergraduate research students that helped with this research.